Hi, I'm Mitch Gallagher from Sweetwater. Today we're going to take a look at how to clean up your tracks, specifically how to remove drum bleed from other tracks. Let's get started. Recently I've been working on tracks for my upcoming EP, which will be called Foundation. Now we recorded these tracks live with the band in Sweetwater Studio A. Keith Carlock was on drums, Michael Whitaker on keyboards, Adam Nitty on bass, and I played rough guitars, and then we went back and overdubbed other parts along the way. Now all the basic tracks were recorded at the same time, so we did have some situations where the drums were bleeding into the keyboards. And the song we're going to look at today is a song called Finch Food, and in this case we've got bleed from the drums into the Hammond organ, which was going through a Leslie and being mic'd in an isolation booth. Now even though it was in an isolation booth, because it was nearby where Keith was playing and because Keith is a very powerful drummer, there still was some drum bleed into those tracks. Let's take a look at how I cleaned that up. Before we start, there's one thing I want to mention, and that's that cleaning tracks sort of falls into the same category as time-shifting, quantizing, or gridding your tracks. It's very easy to overdo it and cause more damage than you do good. What I'm looking for in this case is just to pull back on the bleed a little bit. We've got a busy track with 2 guitars, keyboards, bass, drums, horn section, lead parts, lots going on in this song, and so I don't want any extra clutter going on, particularly in the low end, which is where most of the bleed is taking place in this case. So I caution you, when you're using techniques like this, when you're doing other things to clean up your tracks, to take it easy, to be sort of conservative, and be sure to compare your original tracks to what you've done after you've cleaned them to make sure you aren't causing any artifacts or hurting the audio in any way. With that said, here's how I approach cleaning up some drum bleed into my organ tracks. To begin, let's listen to our organ tracks in isolation so we can hear the material that we're trying to clean up, what we're trying to get rid of through this process. So let's expand the tracks here in Pro Tools. We'll scroll down. Here's our organ tracks. Let's find our spot here. So those are wonderfully played tracks by Michael Whitaker. He really has a great groove going. And it sounds great. Mark Hornsby did a great job of capturing the tracks. But you can hear there's some things going on there in the bottom end that we're probably going to want to clean up. There's almost a rhythm to those bass thumps, and that's going to interfere with what's happening with our drums and our bass part. We don't want that cluttered on there. We'll talk about that a little later. But let me show you some parts where the drums are actually bleeding through. Here's a spot near the beginning where you can definitely hear the drums coming through on the organ part. So you can hear I've gone through and cleaned out some of the track. I've done some edits. For example, right here, I've edited this to remove those drum parts between the places where the organ is actually playing. What I'm interested in removing are these places where the drums are underneath the organ. They're pretty clearly audible there, and because there's a time difference, they were inside a booth, Keith Carlock was out in the room, there's going to be some phase discrepancies and just some clutter happening. Let's take a look at how to remove those. The tool I use for removing things that are underneath another track like that, where they're basically embedded in the same track, is RX from iZotope. The version I have is the new one that just came out, is RX6. So with RX6, what we need to have are the individual tracks. I've pulled those out of Pro Tools. You can see I've got them arrayed here, several different versions of them arrayed here on the side of my screen. Now the track we want to work on is the organ top and bottom. So we'll pull those in. Here's our stereo top. Now these will be the 2 microphones that are on the rotating horn that's at the top of the Leslie cabinet. Now we'll drag in the organ bottom. You can see that second file has been created here inside of RX. It's no problem to have multiple files open simultaneously. Now the organ bottom is the bottom rotor that's inside the Leslie cabinet. It's going to tend to be more bass heavy, not quite as bright, so the bleed's going to be different than what we have inside the top 2 left and right speakers on the upper rotating horn. We'll address those separately. You can do things where you work on combination tracks inside of RX, but when you do so, the processes aren't quite as effective, so I'm going to separate them. We'll work on the stereo top first, then we'll work on the bottom. The tool I'm going to use for this is debleed. Now debleed compares a source track, in this case our drums, with a destination track, or what they call an active track, which is our organ. The debleed process works by comparing the drums against the organ track and subtracting the things that are the same, so it will effectively go in there and remove the drums without affecting the organ sound. To do this, we need to pull in our drums. I prepared a couple of different versions of this. I also prepared a version where it's just the gated kick drum, so it's very specifically just the kick hits. One where it's specifically the gated snare hits. And then I have a combination track where it's the gated kick and the gated snare together. And let's look at how all 4 of those affect what's happening with the organ track. I'm going to go ahead and drag those other tracks in now. So here's our gated snare. Here's our gated kick, and here's our kick and snare together. If we listen to those, here's our kick, here's our snare. Now you'll notice that there's blank space at the beginning of all these tracks. That's because in order for D-Bleed to work its magic, the tracks actually have to be time aligned. The hits have to occur in the same space in your drum track as they do in the organ track. That way it'll look at those same hits and remove them from the organ track. Here's how it works. Let's select our organ track, open D-Bleed, and now we need to tell D-Bleed what the source track is that it's going to be working from. In this case, let's go with, say, our kick and snare together. Once we have our selection made, we can tell D-Bleed to actually learn the profile of the kick and snare at that point and apply that back against our organ. So we'll learn the profile. Here's our various hits. We can also look at the active track, which would be the organ track, and actually you can see where those hits are here in the window. What's going to happen is when we process this, D-Bleed is going to use this bleed source, this kick, snare hits, etc., to remove the corresponding hits inside our active track. So let's listen to what that sounds like. So the difference there isn't dramatic. You can hear what it's done is pull down the ambience, it's pulled down the top end on the snare, but it's not totally removing things. Now that may be good enough. It really is just de-emphasizing the bleed. What we can do is actually process this twice, and that'll result in a much more dramatic drop in the level. So let's go ahead and process this. We'll select our section here. We'll hit process. And now we can preview this and listen to what happens when we run it through a second time. So we've already processed this once using D-Bleed, and now we're going to process it again. You can hear that with this second pass through D-Bleed, the level of the drum bleed has dropped down dramatically compared to the first pass through. So that's a tip that you want to take away from this. You can run through these processes more than once, and in fact sometimes you're better off to do that. Process lightly the first time, process lightly the second time, and that gets you better results than processing heavily one time. Now in my case I'm using heavy reduction strength, which is going to want to pull down those hits, but I've turned the artifact smoothing way up, and that's going to keep any artifacts that might be generated by this process to a minimum. And by running that cleaner setting with the artifact smoothing turned up twice, I think we get a better result, at least for my ears. Now what we'll want to do is switch over to our organ bottom, which is again that lower rotor inside the Leslie cabinet, and apply the exact same technique. If we come over here to the organ bottom, in this track you'll hear just the lower rotor. And if we listen to the same spot in the file, you can hear the bleed is still there in our organ bottom as well. If we clean it up from the top, it's nice to clean it up from the bottom too. So let's go ahead and select our kick and snare. Let's use the gated version this time. We'll select a section here in our track, learn our profile, and apply the process. Now I don't think there's any reason to run that through a second pass. It's pulled down that bleed very nicely. When we combine those two tracks together, or actually three tracks in this case, organ left, organ right, and then the organ bottom, all three of those will be combined together for our final result. That bleed will be dropped way back compared to the original. Let's jump back to Pro Tools, we'll import these files, and you'll see what I mean. I've imported our RX6 tracks. They're right here next to our raw tracks. Here's our organ top raw, organ bottom raw, organ top RX6, and organ bottom RX6. And I've grouped those together so that we can quickly switch between those. Now I've also got two filters here, and we'll talk about those in just a second, but let's bypass them for now. So let's go back, we'll listen to our raw track as it was recorded in the studio. Quite a bit of bleed there. And here's our process track after going through RS6. You can hear we've effectively removed the bleed from our track. It's very quiet. But what we're still hearing here, especially in different places in the track, is there's a lot of bottom end noise happening. There's wind from the rotors, there's thumping from the keys. In some places, there's even more bottom end noise. There's a lot of bottom end information we don't need that's really just going to be messing up or cluttering or basically obscuring what's happening with our bass drum and our bass guitar. So let's go ahead and filter that out. So I have two basically high pass filters set up here. Let's close this. If we open the first one, this is on the organ top, left and right. Basically I have a 24 dB per octave filter that's set at 120 Hertz. It's removing everything below 120 Hertz. On the organ bottom, which is that lower rotor, I've got a similar filter set up, but in this case I've got it set for 60 Hertz because our bass is coming from that track as far as what's coming out of the Leslie speaker. But by cleaning those up, we'll get a much cleaner result. We'll have much less going on in the bottom end, and it'll open things up for our kick drum, make space for our bass guitar as well. So here's what it sounds like before and after we add those filters. This is before the filter. We've got all that bottom end thumping going on there and noise. Now let's turn those filters on. And again, if we go back to our raw tracks that haven't been processed by RX6, there's a big difference. In fact, a lot of times, if you're just trying to remove kick drum bleed, a filter like this will do a very good job for you. It won't take out the higher frequencies, it won't take out the attack from the kick drum, but it will take all that rumble, all that thump, and all that boom that might be coming from a kick drum in your track. So it can be effective to start with that before you try using something like RX6 to remove the bleed from your tracks. One more thing I'd like to add about this process is you will become skilled with using RX6 to remove bleed from your tracks, but there's still a lot of trial and error here, and that's why I made those separate tracks where I had the kick drum separate, the snare drum separate, gated kick and snare, and overall drum mix. The one I ended up using was the overall drum mix because that worked best for what I was trying to remove, but having those other options was able to experiment and hear what really did work the best. So take the time to create some different tracks to use as your bleed source, and I think you'll get really great results using RX6 removing drum bleed from your other tracks. So this gives you an idea of the process I went through to clean up some of the tracks for this song off my EP. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it's easy to overdo this. You can over-clean things. You don't want to completely get rid of the bleed because bleed can be a valuable thing in your mixes. It can add depth, it can add life to your tracks. It's nice to have some bleed between tracks, particularly if they're recorded live. But what you don't want is destructive interference from that bleed, either phase cancellation or muddiness or just cluttered sound, particularly in the low frequencies. I was after a fairly tight, clean sounding bottom end of my tracks, and so I wanted to clean that up and make sure it was speaking clearly. We also had a lot of tracks in the song, and any extra bleed or clutter was going to be apparent in muddiness in the bottom end. So I tried to remove as much of that as I could while maintaining the live feel of the tracks. Thanks for joining me for this look at how to use RX6 and other tools to clean up drum bleed between your tracks. I hope you find it useful in your own mixes. I'm Mitch Gallagher from Sweetwater.